Hello, my name is Amy. I'm 62 years old, and I want to share a story that still feels like a punch to the heart. My son said to me, I know you paid off the $680,000 mortgage on my house, but we're gifting the house to my mother-in-law as an 80th birthday present. Then he added, and you're not invited to the party. I just stood there, stunned, staring at him, feeling a mix of disbelief, sadness, and anger. My hands shook slightly as I turned to my little Yorkshire Terrier Baxter and whispered, Showtime. Let's deliver our gift. I couldn't let this go. I had worked my entire life, often double shifts as a nurse, saving every penny, believing that love and sacrifice for family were never in vain. Yet here I was, blocked, excluded, and underestimated, treated as if my efforts and my heart meant nothing. 3 days later, the day of the party arrived, and everything changed. I pulled up to the house, my heart pounding, Baxter perched proudly by my side with a little bow tie, ready for what was about to happen. The house was full of balloons, laughter, and oblivious faces, unaware of the storm that had just arrived at their doorstep. I had in my purse the key to turning the tables, the truth they had all ignored. Every step I took toward that front door was a step toward reclaiming what was mine and revealing secrets they thought I didn't notice. And believe me, what happened next would shock everyone in that room, especially my son. But before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your comments and seeing where you are. Now let's understand how this story really began. I stood on the front porch at the beautiful colonial house I once believed would be my refuge in old age, a place where holidays would be warm, full of family, where Baxter would run around the yard while David teased me for spoiling him. Instead, the wind cut through my sweater like a reminder that I no longer belonged here. I clutched the bag of homemade cookies with both hands, the warmth long gone from the paper, and tried to keep my voice steady. Baxter, my tiny Yorkshire Terrier, pressed against my ankle, sensing the tension. He always sensed things before I did: arguments, disappointments, the slow, quiet dissolve of love. The door opened, and there he was. My son. My only child. The same boy I once carried on my hip while rushing through double shifts at the hospital. The same boy who swore he'd buy me a house someday when he made it. Now, at 38, he stood in the doorway of the house I had paid off, looking at me as if I were a solicitor selling questionable vacuum cleaners instead of his mother. Mom, you shouldn't have come, he said. No warmth, no smile. Just impatience, layered underneath a veneer of politeness he couldn't quite maintain. I blinked at him. David, I brought cookies. For the party. For Linda. He stepped forward, blocking the doorway entirely, a physical barrier I felt not just in my body but in my chest. Mom! No. Listen, I know you helped with the mortgage. Helped? I whispered, my breath catching. I had worked nights, weekends, holidays, sold my condo, said no to cruises, no to retirement trips with my friends, no to every little luxury because he and Jessica were struggling young parents. Helping wasn't the right word. I had funded his fresh start. He continued as though rehearsed. I know you provided the $680,000 to pay off the mortgage. And we appreciate it, really. His tone said the opposite. I felt my fingers tighten around the cookie bag until the crinkling sound filled the porch. But, he said, clearing his throat, we're gifting the house to my mother-in-law for her 80th birthday. It's something meaningful Jessica has wanted to do for years. The words didn't hit me all at once. They landed in slow motion, like falling bricks. You're gifting the house? I repeated. He nodded, almost cheerfully. Yeah, it means a lot to Jessica. And to her mom. It's a big deal for the family. Family, not our family, theirs. And he added, avoiding eye contact now, you're not invited to the party. I don't remember breathing in that moment. I only remember the burn in my eyes, the pounding in my chest, and the way Baxter nudged my foot before looking up at me with worried little eyes. His presence grounded me. My dog, My silly, loyal, loving Baxter was the only creature on this porch who actually cared that I was hurting. I forced my voice not to tremble. Why would I not be invited? David shrugged, suddenly fascinated by a smudge on the doorframe. Jessica thinks it'll be awkward. With how things have been. You know how sensitive she is? Sensitive. The same woman who once told me to stop hanging around the house like I'm waiting to die. My kindness, it seemed, had aged into something they mistook for weakness. I inhaled slowly, deeply, and handed the bag of cookies to David. "Well," I said, whispering to Baxter, "showtime. Let's deliver our gift." Even though I wasn't invited, even though they wanted to hide me like an embarrassing secret, I had something far heavier, far more consequential than cookies. "Mom, don't make a scene," David muttered as I stepped backward down the porch steps. "A scene?" I repeated softly. "No, sweetheart. I'm done making scenes. I'm making decisions." I turned toward my car. With every step, something inside me cracked, but another part of me, something old, something strong stirred. When I opened the car door, a tear slipped down my cheek. I wiped it quickly before Baxter could see. He always got upset when I cried. As I sat behind the wheel, the truth settled over me like a heavy, familiar blanket. For years, I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, that being a mother meant giving until there was nothing left to give, that family meant forgiveness even when forgiveness wasn't earned. But I also remembered something else, something David had forgotten, a detail, a tiny, critical detail buried inside paperwork we had signed 5 years ago. Something he dismissed as boomer paperwork nonsense. A detail that would soon unravel every single one of his plans, every manipulation, every cruel dismissal. A detail he never imagined I would use. As I placed Baxter gently in the passenger seat and turned the key in the ignition, my heart steadied. David had forgotten that in this house, this beautiful colonial home with its manicured lawn and polished shutters, I wasn't the guest. I was the creditor. And creditors do not take kindly to betrayal. 3 days later, on the day of the grand birthday party, the day they intended to parade this house as a family gift, everything would begin to change. And my son's life, my sweet boy, whom I once swore I'd protect from the world, was about to face a storm he never saw coming, because even the softest hearts have limits, and mine had just been reached. My rental apartment always feels a little too quiet, especially at night. The walls are thin enough that I hear the neighbor's television, but somehow the silence inside still presses in on me, folding around my shoulders like a damp sheet. After selling my condo years ago to help David and Jessica, this place was supposed to be temporary, just a simple in-between. But in-between stretched into years, the way small sacrifices for family often do, unnoticed and unappreciated. Tonight, though, the silence felt different, intentional almost, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Baxter lay curled on the sofa, his little head resting on the armrest, one ear perked and the other flopped down. When I crossed the room, his head tilted in that way he always does when he senses I'm about to do something unusual or something painful. "Come on, sweetheart," I murmured, kneeling beside the old fireproof lockbox I kept tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. "Time to see if your mom was as foolish as they think, or a little smarter." My hands shook only a little as I dragged the heavy lockbox into the center of the living room. The metal scraped across the floor, and Baxter's second ear perked up. He jumped down and hopped closer, sniffing the edges with exaggerated seriousness, as if he believed he was part of some covert operation rather than just a curious terrier. I sat cross-legged on the rug and clicked open the lid. A dusty smell rose from inside old paper, old ink, old memories that hadn't been disturbed in years. There were birth certificates, insurance statements, photographs from a time when life was softer around the edges. But none of that was what I needed. I reached down to the very bottom and pulled out a blue folder, its edges faded, the top coated in a thin layer of dust. I brushed it off with my sleeve, and the moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt the familiar solidity return to me. The woman who, for 40 years, navigated hospital bureaucracy like a battlefield, catching every discrepancy, every missing signature, every attempt to cut corners. Being a mother softened me, yes, but it never erased what I learned in those decades. I wasn't just a retiree. I was someone who knew how to read the fine print. I opened the folder, and the rustle of paper seemed louder than it should have been. Baxter sat down beside me, watching intently, as if he understood the gravity of what I was doing. "Remember this?" I whispered, though the question was for myself. The loan agreement, the promissory note, the deed of trust. The documentation David had skimmed, barely before signing. Back then, he'd been in such a hurry. "Mom, I'm late for work," he'd said, tapping his pen impatiently, barely glancing at the sections I instinctively triple-checked. He had forgotten. Of course he had. Jessica probably never bothered to read any of it at all. And Linda. Well, she certainly had no idea she was celebrating her birthday inside a house that wasn't hers to own. I slipped my finger along the margin of one page, tracing the place where a key clause lived quietly, unobtrusively. A clause I had added not out of mistrust but out of habit, out of the understanding that people can change, circumstances can change, promises can dissolve. "I always believed in helping family," I murmured to Baxter, who blinked slowly, listening the way only a dog can listen, without judgment, without impatience. "But I also believe in insurance. Insurance is how you stay safe when people forget how to love you." A memory tugged at me. David, sitting across from me at my old kitchen table, signing his name quickly, the scribble barely legible. He didn't read the documents because he was busy, because he trusted me, or because he assumed I'd never need to protect myself from him. Maybe all three. He'd changed. I'd changed. Life had changed. But the documents hadn't. I took a steady breath and closed the folder, the weight of it grounding me. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. With an old strength I'd allowed to rust over the years, Baxter sniffed the folder, then looked at me with his big, dark eyes. I stroked the top of his head. "You ready for dinner, little man?" I asked. His tail wagged instantly. I pushed myself up from the floor and moved to the tiny kitchen, where I pulled a small steak from the refrigerator, one I'd bought especially for him because I knew tonight would require comfort for both of us. As it sizzled in the pan, Baxter pranced around my feet, nails tapping against the tile. "You know," I said as I flipped the steak, "they think I'm just a senile checkbook, a sweet, harmless old lady who hands out money because she's lonely." I paused, leaning against the counter, letting the truth settle in my bones, but they forgot something important. Baxter sat, watching me, waiting for the next part. "I'm the one who taught them how to count." The steak finished cooking, and I cut it into tiny pieces, placing them gently in Baxter's bowl. He devoured it with unrestrained happiness, as if the world had no cruelty, no betrayal, only moments like this, warm light, a full belly, and someone who loves you. I wished for a moment that I saw the world like he did, but wishes didn't protect houses. Wishes didn't protect mothers. Wishes didn't protect dignity. Documents did. After Baxter finished eating, I wiped his face with a napkin. He hated it, squirming dramatically, and then sat back down at the dining table with the blue folder open wide, the pages fanned out like a lifeline. I read through everything twice, marking sections with sticky notes, underlining key parts, my hospital-honed instincts working with mechanical precision. Every now and then, emotions surged in my chest, heartbreak, betrayal, anger, but I swallowed it down, focusing instead on clarity. Clarity was power. Clarity was control. By the time I closed the folder again, the clock on the wall read nearly 10. Baxter had curled up in a small, warm circle near my feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep. Chasing whatever adventurous dreams small dogs dream of, I reached for my phone. My fingers hesitated. Not because I doubted myself, no, that doubt had burned away on David's porch, but because calling Robert meant stepping fully into the storm. Robert wasn't just any attorney. He was an old friend, someone who'd known me back when I still believed life would get easier with age. Someone who'd seen me in hospital corridors at 3 a.m. after a night of triage and emergency rooms and whispered prayers. He would hear my voice and know immediately that something was wrong. Still, this couldn't wait. I dialed his number. The ring lasted only a moment before he answered, his familiar voice warm and steady. "Amy?" I didn't let myself stall. I didn't say hello. I didn't soften my tone to make the news more palatable. I simply asked the question that would determine everything that came next. Is the protective clause in the deed of trust still active? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. It was the moment before the storm begins. The coffee shop smelled like roasted beans and cinnamon, the kind of place where the lights were warm enough to soften the world, but not so dim that secrets could hide easily. I chose a table by the window, partly for the light and partly because I needed to feel the world moving around me, strangers walking past, conversations bubbling, cups clinking. Life. The kind of life I'd somehow drifted away from while trying to hold my family together. I wore my best blouse, the soft cream one with the delicate embroidery at the collar. I wanted to look composed, not defeated, graceful, not brittle. But when my reflection flickered in the darkened window, I could see that determination had taken root in my expression. My chin lifted a little higher than usual. My shoulders squared themselves. Something in me had shifted, and there was no turning back. Robert walked in with the familiar, heavy stride that always made me feel like the room had suddenly gained a foundation. He spotted me immediately and offered a soft smile, a mixture of affection, concern, and the quiet calculation of an attorney who already suspected the reason for this meeting. "You look good, Amy," he said as he sat down, loosening his scarf. "Strong." "I don't feel strong," I admitted, "but I'm trying." He nodded slowly, letting the truth breathe between us before he pulled the folder from his briefcase. The same blue folder I had handed him the night before, the edges now straightened, marked with colored tabs and neat annotations. He had always been meticulous, one of the reasons I trusted him. "You did everything right," he said, tapping the folder gently. "More right than most people with legal training." A faint, humorless laugh escaped me. 40 years in hospital bureaucracy teaches you how to survive paperwork. He opened the documents, and the rustle felt loud even in the bustling cafe. "Let's go through this step by step," he said. I nodded, though each step was burned into my memory already. He pointed to the first document, the promissory note, 0-interest loan, payable to Baxter Holdings, LLC. Hearing the name spoken aloud felt strange, even now. Baxter Holdings, named after the dog who had never betrayed me. At the time I created the LLC, it had been a private joke, an expression of tenderness toward the only creature who always treated me like I mattered. I never imagined that little company would become the backbone of my protection. Robert lifted his gaze. "You didn't give David the money. You structured it as a loan, secured, properly executed, properly notarized." "I told him," I said quietly, "that I'd take care of the details." He was in a rush. He didn't want to read anything. "He didn't," Robert confirmed. "And he definitely didn't check the county records. If he had, he would have seen that the deed of trust was recorded the same week the original mortgage was paid off." He flipped to the next document, tapping the margin where my signature curved neatly across the page. "This deed of trust names your LLC as the beneficiary. It's clean, it's valid, and it's public." For a moment, something inside me twisted, shame or sorrow. I wasn't sure. "I never meant for it to be used," I whispered. "It was just a structure." A safety net. The kind mothers build quietly, hoping never to need them. He nodded, leaning back. A safety net is still a net, Amy. And David stepped straight into it. I swallowed, letting his words settle. Now, he continued gently, the payments. My stomach tightened. He called them silly. Said it was ridiculous to make symbolic monthly payments on a loan he thought I'd never enforce. But they mattered, Robert said. For the loan to remain active, he had to make them. They were nominal, barely $50, just enough to show good faith. 3 months, I whispered. He didn't pay for 3 months. That's why you're here, Robert said, his voice soft but steady. Under Virginia law, that's a default. And because this is a deed of trust, not a mortgage, doesn't require a judge. Non-judicial foreclosure, faster, cleaner. I felt the words hit me with a strange dual force-like armor and injury at the same time. I never wanted to hurt him, I said, my voice breaking before I could stop it. I wanted to protect myself, but I thought if I planned well enough, if I was generous enough, if I kept loving him the way a mother loves unconditionally, then maybe we'd always be okay. His eyes softened. Love doesn't erase consequences, Amy. I looked down at my hands, folded neatly in my lap, the way my own mother used to fold hers when she needed strength. I remembered Jessica's voice, sharp and dismissive, quote, drifting through the hallway that day when she thought I couldn't hear. She's just old baggage, David. Dead weight. We don't owe her anything. The memory stung like a fresh burn. It swept up from my chest to my throat, tightening until I had to inhale sharply to keep from crying right there at the small coffee shop table. I'm his mother, I said, the words trembling. How did we get here? Robert didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer, not one that would soften the truth or justify the pain. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick red envelope, placing it gently between us on the table. Its color was bold, almost jarring, too alive compared to everything I felt inside. This, he said softly, is the notice of default. It gives him the required time to cure the loan, but once it's served, the foreclosure clock begins. 30 days. After that, the sale can be scheduled. My breath trembled. The envelope looked heavier than paper should ever look. If you serve this at the party, he continued, there is no going back. No pretending this didn't happen. No undoing the line you'll be drawing. I stared at the red envelope, feeling the weight of years pressing down on me. Years of small sacrifices, whispered humiliations, quiet erasures of my worth. Years of love that had stretched thin, frayed, and finally snapped. For a moment, I feared my voice wouldn't work at all. But when it came, it was quiet, raw, honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in far too long. He's already broken me, I whispered. Robert closed his briefcase slowly, respectfully, as though acknowledging a funeral, and, in a way, he was. I had rehearsed the moment in my mind 100 times. Yet, when the afternoon sun hit the windshield and revealed the glittering decorations on the house I once believed would hold my family together, something inside me tightened. The place shimmered with balloons, gold, white, metallic rose. A catering truck idled near the curb, the smell of roasted figs and honeyed glaze drifting through the air in a way that felt almost mocking. This was the celebration I wasn't meant to see, the home I wasn't supposed to enter, the life I had paid for, but no longer belonged to. I pulled my old sedan into the driveway between 2 towering SUVs, each polished so bright I could see my own anxious reflection in their doors. Baxter climbed into my lap, his warm weight grounding me. He looked up at me with those round, earnest eyes, the kind that always seemed to understand more than any human ever did. I straightened the tiny tuxedo bow tie around his neck. It had been a silly impulse purchase a year ago, meant for nothing more than a Halloween photo. Today, it felt like armor. You look more dignified than all of them combined, I whispered, kissing the top of his head. He wagged once and settled back into the passenger seat, as if bracing himself for whatever came next. My purse sat open, the red envelope tucked inside like a living thing, thick, weighty, pulsing with consequence. Robert had pressed it into my hands 2 days earlier with the kind of expression lawyers saved for war widows. "If you serve this at the party, there is no going back," he'd said quietly. "It starts the foreclosure clock." But the truth was simpler and far more painful. The foreclosure had already started inside me. It had begun the moment David changed the locks and told me the home I had financed was no longer emotionally healthy for him and Jessica. It had deepened when Jessica called me old baggage, and I saw David pretend he hadn't heard. It rooted itself fully the moment I realized that the boy I had raised, the same boy whose nightmares I soothed, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose graduation cap I straightened with trembling pride, could look at me and see nothing but an inconvenience. I inhaled slowly, my lungs trembling. No turning back. Not anymore. I got out of the car, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I had chosen something simple, elegant, a dark navy wrap that made me feel dignified, not invisible. Baxter trotted at my heel, little bow tie bouncing with each step. The closer we got to the house, the louder the party chatter became. Laughter, clinking glasses, a string quartet playing something bright and festive. And then I saw her, Jessica's mother, Linda, standing near the patio doors with a champagne flute hovering awkwardly between her fingers. She looked beautiful, but uneasy, the way people do when they sense they've been invited to a celebration built on a fault line. Her eyes scanned the interior of the house, the high ceilings, the polished wood floors, the expensive arrangements of orchids and eucalyptus. Something about her expression told me she didn't know everything, not yet. For a moment, I wondered if she saw me the way everyone else did. The quiet, harmless older woman whose presence was tolerated but never desired. The one who wrote checks and asked for nothing. The one who had sold her condo, her safe place, to fund this dream home. The one everyone assumed would stay silent forever. But today was different. Today, silence wasn't survival. It was surrender. And I was done surrendering. My hands shook as I approached the walkway, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, fierce and bright. The kind that fills your chest when you realize you are finally standing up for the version of yourself you buried long ago. I reached down and brushed Baxter's back, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breathing. He pressed closer, as if reminding me he was here, my companion, my witness, my unyielding little heartbeat on 4 legs. "Okay," I whispered to him. "Let's do this." We walked further up the drive, my heels clicking against the stone path. I held my head high, the way my mother had taught me when I was a girl navigating a world that liked to pretend women faded after 50. The security guard stepped forward the moment he spotted me, lifting a hand in a gesture meant to stop, not guide, but stop. It was instinctive, almost rehearsed, as if someone had warned him an unwanted guest might appear. "I'm sorry, ma'am, this is a private." He didn't finish because David appeared behind him. I saw the exact moment recognition hit, first confusion, then disbelief, and then a shock so visceral that it drained the color from his face in an instant. His mouth parted just a little, the way it used to when he'd walk into a surprise test in school completely unprepared. His shoulders slumped. His hands twitched. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground shift beneath him. "Mom?" One word. Small. Fragile. Laden with guilt he hadn't yet admitted. I stood still, Baxter pressed against my shin, and met my son's eyes with all the steadiness I had fought to reclaim. And in that suspended moment, before explanations, before denials, before the storm that was coming, David understood something he had never expected to confront. I had not come here to be turned away. I had come to collect what was mine. The moment I stepped inside the house, the noise hit me like a wall after. Clinking glasses, the hum of conversations rising and overlapping, the faint sound of the DJ testing transitions between songs. The living room was overflowing with guests dressed in elegant shades of cream, gold, and black. Everything looked curated, staged, intentional. But as I moved through the doorway, a quiet ripple passed through the room. People noticed me, even if they didn't want to. Baxter stayed close to my ankle, walking with deliberate little steps, as if he sensed the tension tightening around me. His tiny bow tie bobbed proudly, a small spark of dignity in a room dripping with curated luxury. David reached me in seconds. Not with warmth, not with relief, but with urgency, sharp, panicked, and tinged with something uglier. He grabbed my elbow, fingers digging in harder than he probably realized, and leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my cheek. "I told you not to come," he hissed. "You're embarrassing us. Embarrassing us." The words hit me with a quiet, devastating accuracy, because they weren't new. They were the echo of 100 smaller wounds, built up over years of him choosing convenience over compassion. I held his gaze, refusing to shrink. "I was invited," I said evenly, "and I came to wish Linda a happy birthday." Across the room, Jessica appeared with perfect timing, as if summoned by the scent of discomfort. She glided toward us in her glittering gold dress, chin tilted with the kind of practiced superiority she wore like a second skin. The moment her eyes landed on me, her lips curled into a sneer so subtle most people wouldn't notice, but I did. I always did. "Oh," she said, voice dripping false sweetness. "You made it." "No thanks to your husband changing the locks," I replied calmly. Her smile faltered for a microsecond, so quick an untrained eye would miss it. But I wasn't untrained. 40 years in hospital administration had taught me to read micro-expressions the way others read headlines. I felt David stiffen beside me. He wanted the confrontation over. Wanted me gone. Wanted the scene minimized so the party, their beautiful, expensive, carefully staged party could continue untainted by my presence. But I didn't come for them. I came for the truth. And for once in my life, I was done whispering. I raised my voice just enough for the nearest guest to hear without it sounding like shouting. "I just wanted to wish Linda a happy birthday," I said with a small, graceful smile, "and deliver the final loan paperwork you requested." 2 conversations behind us stopped abruptly. Jessica's head snapped toward David. Lind, standing near the fireplace talking to a pair of cousins, looked over with confusion knitting her brow. Her eyes moved from me to David and back again. David's reaction was immediate and shockingly transparent. His entire face lit up, cheeks lifting, eyes widening, the tension in his posture evaporating like steam. And in that instant, the truth was clear. He thought he'd won. He thought the red envelope in my purse contained a full release of the lien, that I had surrendered my position, that the house was finally his, clean and clear, with no strings, no obligations, and no mother behind the scenes holding the deed of trust that made him uncomfortable. Greed flickered behind his eyes like a match being struck. "Mom," he said, voice now syrupy smooth, "why didn't you tell me? This is wonderful." I watched him, studying the way excitement replaced hostility in a heartbeat. The way he puffed his chest just a bit, as if he'd orchestrated this moment. As if kindness were something he deserved by default. For a brief second, guilt pricked me. Not for what I was doing, no, that felt justified, necessary, but for the child he once was. The boy who used to run toward me with scraped knees and trembling hands. The teenager who called me at midnight during freshman year because he couldn't find his dorm building. The young man who promised he'd take care of me someday. But that boy was gone. And the man standing before me had made choices, painful ones, selfish ones, irreversible ones. I reached into my purse, fingers brushing the thick red envelope. I didn't pull it out yet. The moment needed to land where it belonged, on the stage. He was so eager to climb. Jessica's expression changed too. She stood straighter, chin higher, eyes sparkling with a triumphant, brittle kind of satisfaction. The kind that only blooms when someone thinks the battle is already won. David turned toward the DJ, who was mid-song, and gestured wildly. Hey, 1 second, he called out, weaving through the clusters of guests with a renewed sense of entitlement. David, I said softly, you don't need to, but he didn't hear me. Or maybe he chose not to. He reached the DJ booth, grabbed the microphone without asking, and turned to face the crowd with a grin that made him look like a man about to announce a lottery win. Everyone, he shouted, clinking the mic with his knuckle. Can I have your attention for a moment? The music faded. Conversations quieted. Dozens of eyes turned toward him and then toward me. Baxter barked once, a soft, uncertain sound, sensing the shift in the air. David lifted the microphone, shoulders squared with pride. My mother has arrived, he announced grandly, with the final surprise for Linda. The room gasped and applauded. Linda blinked at me, bewildered. Jessica beamed. And David looked at me with a self-satisfied confidence that felt like a dagger wrapped in velvet. I felt my smile stretch slowly across my face, not celebratory, but steady, certain, almost serene. Oh, it's a surprise, all right. Just not the kind he thinks. For a moment, time felt suspended, like the air had thickened, like the room itself was holding its breath. All I could hear was the soft hum of the lights overhead, and the rapid, worried thump of David's heartbeat beside me. Baxter squirmed in my arms, unsure of why so many eyes were on us, so many faces turned expectantly in our direction. His little bow tie brushed against my chin as I held him closer, grounding myself in his warmth. Someone handed me the microphone, maybe the DJ, maybe David, maybe I simply reached out and took it. I honestly can't remember. All I know is that suddenly the weight of it was in my palm, cool and solid, anchoring me to the moment I had spent weeks preparing for and years being pushed toward. I stepped forward, my feet sinking slightly into the thick, cream-colored rug. The crowd shifted, murmurs dying into silence. I saw faces, friends of Linda's, co-workers of David's, neighbors who barely knew my name but knew my reputation as David's mother. The woman who never made trouble. The woman who blended into the background. Tonight, that version of me was gone. I lifted the microphone, my voice soft but steady. I'm so happy to be here, I began, letting warmth fill my tone. To celebrate Linda, a woman I've come to respect, and to say a few words about family and sacrifice, and the places we call home. A few people smiled politely. Jessica crossed her arms. David gave me an encouraging nod that might have fooled someone who didn't know him as well as I did. I let the sweetness continue, let it melt across the room like honey. You all know this house, I said, letting my eyes travel slowly along the walls. You've eaten meals here, celebrated birthdays, watched babies take their first steps right across this floor. I paused, feeling the tremble of old memories pushing up like soft earth disturbed by a shovel. I remember planting the rose bushes in the backyard, I continued. Little pink ones. David insisted on digging the holes himself even though he bent the first 3 shovels trying. And I remember painting the nursery upstairs, how Jessica wanted everything white and modern, and I kept sneaking in soft blue accents when she wasn't looking. Several guests laughed quietly. Even Jessica's mother cracked a small smile. But Jessica herself looked like she was chewing glass. I let my fingers stroke Baxter's fur as I spoke, grounding myself in the rhythm of his breathing. This house, I said softly, means a great deal to me. Not because of its size, or its price, or the neighborhood, but because of the dreams built inside it. The memories, the promises. My voice wavered slightly on that last word, not for show, not for effect, but because the truth always shakes something loose. And I want to say, I continued, my eyes softening, that I raised David to be a good man, a thoughtful man, a man who would protect his family, not hide behind them. I could feel the room begin to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like ice starting to crack under the first thaw of spring. People leaned in a little closer. Hearts seemed to tighten and pull in my direction. But sometimes, I said gently, children lose their way. David's expression froze. Jessica's eyebrows shot upward. A thin, sharp movement. A few guests exchanged confused glances. Sometimes, I continued, they forget who actually financed the roof over their heads. The silence sharpened. It became something tangible, almost metallic in the air. And sometimes, I said, letting the sweetness drain from my voice, leaving something clearer, firmer, they forget that those gifts came with strings attached. Jessica's mouth dropped open, not wide, but enough for me to see the truth flicker in her eyes. Fear. David shifted beside me, his hands tightening into fists. I saw him silently begging me with his expression, as if he could still steer this moment back into safety. But the wheel was no longer in his hands. Baxter let out a tiny, uncertain woof, sensing the storm forming around us. All around the living room, faces changed, confusion blooming first, then curiosity, then a cautious sort of dread as the meaning behind my words sank deeper. I took a breath, letting the air fill my lungs slowly, as though preparing for a long dive beneath turbulent waters. My hands didn't shake now, not anymore. They were steady, deliberate, strong in a way I hadn't felt in years. I lowered the microphone just a little, freeing my other hand. My purse felt heavy at my side, not because of its contents, but because of the truth it held. The truth I had protected. The truth I had carried alone. I reached into it. The rustle of paper, the soft scrape of the envelope sliding free, it was subtle, but the entire room seemed to zero in on the motion. Even the lights felt hotter, brighter. I held the red envelope in my hand, its color deep and stark against the soft tones of the party. A sharp inhale rippled through the crowd. I lifted the microphone again. David, I said, and the name tasted bittersweet on my tongue. You said this house is a gift for Linda. He swallowed hard. His voice, when he tried to speak, cracked as though it had splintered. Mom, don't! But you can't transfer, I continued over him, my tone calm, almost tender. What's encumbered by debt you haven't repaid? The words dropped into the room like stones cast into still water. People blinked. A woman in the front pressed her hand to her chest. Linda's face went pale, not dramatically, but gradually, like the color was draining from her skin second by second. And David looked as if the entire floor had tilted beneath him. I held the envelope a little closer to my chest, not as a weapon, but as a truth I could no longer carry alone. And for the first time that night, the room was completely, utterly silent. For several long seconds, no one moved. It felt as if the entire room had been frozen mid-breath, like the moment before a fragile glass sculpture topples and shatters. I could hear the bass from the speakers in the other room vibrating faintly through the walls, hear Baxter's quiet snuffle against my arm, but the guests, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, all of it had evaporated. David stared at the red envelope as if it had burned him. His fingers twitched, the tendons in his hands standing out sharply. His eyes flicked up to mine wide, pleading, furious, terrified, all layered on top of each other, like emotions fighting for space and oxygen. "Open it," I said softly. I hadn't planned to speak those words, but they slipped out, almost gentle. A mother's tone. A tone that remembered the first time he held a crayon. The first time he scraped his knee. The first time he lied about breaking a window. A tone that remembered all the versions of him I had loved, even when he made it so impossibly hard. David tore into the envelope. The rip wasn't clean. It stuttered, caught, hesitated, like his hands were struggling to obey him. Paper crinkled loudly in the silence. When he pulled out the folded document, his breath hitched. Then he read. His lips shaped each word in slow motion, as if his mind couldn't absorb the meaning fast enough. His eyes scanned the first paragraph once, twice, a third time, his chest rising and falling in uneven, fractured breaths. Then he whispered the title aloud, his voice cracking on the final word. Notice of default, an intent to foreclose. A murmur rippled through the guests, a soft wave of gasps and shocked whispers. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered on the tile like punctuation. I didn't look away from David. I couldn't, because this was the moment he finally saw the truth I had carried alone for so long. The moment he realized I had never been the fool he counted on me to be. His voice wavered. "Mom, what is this?" "It's what it says," I replied gently. "It's the official notice. The one required under Virginia law, 21 days. The clock starts tonight." David blinked rapidly, panic swelling beneath his skin like heat rising off asphalt. He flipped to the second page, scanning desperately for something. An escape hatch, a loophole, a miracle. And then he froze, his brow furrowed. He leaned closer to the page, his lips parted. "What is?" "Baxter Holdings, Leld's." I lifted Baxter just a little, letting his small brown and gray face peek into the line of sight. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is Baxter." The room erupted in a mix of nervous laughter, disbelief, and stunned silence. I continued, the words soft but sharp enough to cut through the haze. "David, meet your creditor's namesake. Baxter Holdings, LLC, is my company. My name isn't on the document because I structured the loan properly. The house is encumbered by a lien payable to Baxter Holdings. You signed the promissory note. You agreed to the deed of trust. And you have missed 3 months of good faith payments." He shook his head, eyes wild. "Mom, those were symbolic. I didn't think—" "I know you didn't," I said. "You thought I wouldn't enforce my rights. You assumed I'd always clean up after you, always sacrifice, always disappear when you wanted me to." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "So yes," I said softly, "we're initiating foreclosure to protect my investment." Jessica's shriek sliced through the room like a blade. "You crazy old witch!" she screamed, heels clacking violently against the floor as she lunged toward me. "You can't do this! You can't!" Her face was contorted, red and furious. Her hands curled into claws as if she genuinely meant to tear the envelope from my grip or tear into me. But before she could reach me, a voice thundered across the room. Actually, it boomed, low and authoritative. "She can." The words dropped like an anvil. Every head snapped toward the back of the room. And I felt a single sharp breath fill my lungs, relief, shock. And something else entirely, the knowledge that the tide had just turned in my favor. In a way no one, not even I, had expected. The room was still vibrating from the first shock. Voices overlapping in a chaotic tangle of accusation, confusion, and a kind of stunned disbelief that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. People who minutes earlier were laughing around the buffet table now stood frozen with half-filled plates, the DJ slowly lowering the music as though afraid that even sound might shatter the fragile tension hanging between all of us. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, on David, on Jessica, on Linda, who stood beside the cake table with a strange rigidness, as if her body understood the truth before her mind did. My heart thudded heavy and sorrowful, not triumphant. I never came here to humiliate anyone. I'd only come to stop a disaster before it took half the family down with it. The murmurs rose in uneven waves, people whispering names, fragments of questions, trying to piece meaning together from scraps of overheard sentences. It was the kind of collective disbelief that makes a whole room hold its breath. And then Robert stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something about his presence, calm, sturdy, unflinching, that cut clean through the panic like a blade through fabric. "Everyone," he said gently, "I think there's something important you should understand." David stiffened. Jessica's face lost color in a sharp, draining rush, and Linda, poor Linda, instinctively reached out to steady herself on the back of a chair. Robert continued as though speaking to a courtroom, but his tone held a softness, a mercy, as if he wished he didn't have to say any of this out loud. David and Jessica were preparing to transfer the house title to Linda, he explained, without disclosing the active lien Amy holds. They intended to leverage Linda's excellent credit to secure a new loan against the property, then keep the cash proceeds for themselves. A ripple of gasps rolled through the crowd. He didn't dramatize, didn't accuse. He simply stated the truth as clean and undeniable as a surgical incision. That, he added in the same calm voice, constitutes a fraudulent transfer. It is a scheme designed to hide assets and hinder a legitimate creditor, a felony in many jurisdictions. For a moment, it seemed like the entire party leaned away from David and Jessica, as though the words had physically pushed them. David's jaw trembled. Not with rage. No, for the first time tonight I saw something else in him. Something raw. Fear. The sudden, devastating realization that his little plan wasn't a family arrangement. It was a crime. And it had just been named in front of 50 witnesses. Jessica tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat moved, her lips parted, but the air refused to shape itself into a defense. Linda stared at her daughter, her expression collapsing into something wounded and horrified. You told me it was a gift, she whispered. Her voice cracked at the end, like an old branch under too much weight. Jessica swallowed, eyes darting, a trapped animal searching for escape. Mom, it's not what it sounds like. Linda's hand shot up, trembling but firm enough to silence her. I could see tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, not from anger, but from a kind of maternal grief that carved itself deep into the lines around her mouth. You were going to drag me into fraud? She asked softly. Not shouted, not screamed. Just asked, as though truly trying to understand how her own daughter had almost handed her a signed invitation to ruin. The room fell painfully silent. Jessica flinched. David looked away, as though even he couldn't bear to witness the disappointment radiating from his mother's face. I let out a slow, steady breath. My hands felt icy, yet my voice when I finally stepped forward carried a warmth. Something I hadn't expected to encounter tonight. Resolve. Linda, I murmured softly, none of this was your fault. You were deceived, misled. Then I turned my gaze to David, and the ache in my chest intensified. I didn't do any of this to be cruel, David. He raised his eyes to me, red, wide, drowning. I shook my head gently. I did it to prevent you from crossing a line you couldn't return from. You think I wanted to reveal any of this? That I enjoyed it? My voice quivered, not with anger, but with the heaviness of truth. I'm not punishing you. I'm saving you from prison, not just homelessness. The words hit him harder than any public humiliation ever could. I saw the exact second they reached him, the moment he understood this wasn't vengeance, it was protection. A final act of love he didn't deserve but desperately needed. His breath hitched, and then his knees buckled. David dropped to the floor like a man whose strings had been cut, hands shaking, eyes wide with the shock of someone discovering the full, unbearable weight of his own choices. Gasps echoed around the room, but nobody moved to help him. He pressed both hands to his face and sobbed, not the angry, defensive tears from earlier, but the quiet kind that come from realizing you've destroyed something precious with your own hands. My God, he whispered through his fingers. What have I done? Jessica stood frozen beside him, stunned into a silence that felt almost eerie. She seemed to shrink, her spine curling in on itself as though trying to disappear into her own shadow. Linda looked away from them, her shoulders shaking. I wondered if she was grieving the children she thought she had. or grieving the trust she now realized had been misplaced for years. The crowd started murmuring again, but softer this time, sympathetic in places, judgmental in others, though all of it seemed far away from me, because I wasn't looking at David anymore. I wasn't looking at Jessica, or Linda, or the crowd. I was looking at the door that meant future, distance, breath, a life no longer bound by these cycles of manipulation and guilt, a door that held something like hope on the other side, quiet, tentative but real. David continued to sob behind me, his tears soaking into the carpet he'd once boasted about choosing during a renovation I'd paid for. For years I would have turned back, knelt, comforted him, tried to rescue him from himself, but not tonight. Tonight, I simply inhaled, lifted my chin, and let the faintest, most bittersweet whisper of relief loosen my shoulders. This wasn't the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of my freedom. And as I took a single step toward the door, the noise around me faded until all I could hear was my own calm, steady heartbeat, leading me somewhere new, somewhere honest, somewhere finally mine. I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't need to. The night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, cool against my flushed skin, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant rain. The party's noise, the arguments, the accusations, the disbeliefs, pealed out behind me in muffled bursts each time someone opened the front door. But out here on the lawn, the world felt strangely quiet, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath after holding one far too long. Red and blue lights flickered down the street, painting the white picket fences in shifting stripes of color. The police cars rolled in slowly, their tires crunching over the gravel, their headlights sweeping across the lawn like a spotlight searching for the truth that had finally forced its way into the open. Guests scattered before the cruisers even came to a full stop. Women clutching purses, men muttering excuses. Everyone eager to flee the unraveling scene before their names could become footnotes in someone else's scandal. High heels clicked against the driveway, car doors slammed, engines roared to life. It looked less like the end of a birthday party and more like an evacuation. Jessica stumbled down the porch steps, mascara streaking down her cheeks in uneven lines. She was sobbing loudly, the kind of sob that wasn't grief so much as panic, a desperate attempt to outrun consequences already closing in. She shoved David's shoulder with both hands. "This is your fault," she cried. "You said your mother would sign. You said it was safe. You lied to me." David didn't shove back. He didn't speak. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there in the glow of the porch light, shoulders slumped forward as if his body had finally surrendered under the weight of everything he'd avoided. Admitting for years, his eyes stayed fixed on the house. My house, technically, though I knew I wouldn't keep it. I didn't want to. I wanted closure, not a monument to everything that had gone wrong. He stared at it with a quiet, hollow devastation, as though watching a life he'd built out of shortcuts and half-truths dissolve grain by grain. His silence was almost eerie, but not cruel. It was the silence of someone finally seeing the full shape of their mistakes and having no words left to soften it. Robert stood near the bottom of the driveway, talking to the officers with calm precision, his voice low but firm. I caught pieces of their conversation as I approached to retrieve Baxter from where he'd been clinging nervously around my ankles. Emails confirming intent. Time-stamped. Yes, subpoenaed earlier today. Attempt to transfer a lien-encumbered property under false representation. The officers nodded, taking notes. There was no rush, no dramatic handcuffs, no shouting. Not tonight. Fraud wasn't usually that kind of crime. But their presence alone was enough to carve the truth into the moment with painful clarity. When I turned, I saw Linda standing in the doorway. She looked smaller than she had inside the house, shrunk by grief, by shock, by the realization that the people she loved most had tried to use her as a shield, a tool, a name to attach their wrongdoing to. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, wringing the thin fabric of her blouse. And her eyes were full of a quiet ache that made my throat tighten. She stepped down slowly, one careful foot at a time, as if each stair carried a separate truth she had to face before moving to the next. When she reached the lawn, she looked up at me with an expression that blended apology and gratitude into something fragile and deeply human. "Amy," she whispered. I nodded once, not trusting my voice. And then she reached for me, not tentatively, not politely, but with the full, trembling weight of a mother whose world had been shaken. She wrapped her arms around me, pressing her cheek to my shoulder. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice unsteady. "Thank you for the truth. I suspected something was wrong. I felt it in my bones, but I didn't know. I didn't want to believe that they'd risk me like that." Her breath hitched. I closed my eyes. "I know," I whispered back. "I know you didn't." We stood there for a long moment, not as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, not as figures on opposite sides of a broken marriage, but simply as two women who had lived too long with things unsaid. The embrace wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was grounding, necessary, a moment that allowed something heavy inside me to finally break loose and drift away. When she pulled back, her fingers lingered on my arm. "You did the right thing," she said softly, "even if they can't see it yet." Her voice wavered on they, as though already preparing her heart for a painful distance she hadn't yet accepted. I nodded again, and this time the weight truly began to lift. Not because the situation was resolved. It wasn't, not legally, not emotionally, not in any way that counted as simple. But the truth was out now. The danger had been stopped, and the guilt I'd carried of being the one to shatter illusions no longer felt like guilt at all. Baxter tugged at his leash, and I released a slow, shaky breath before setting him down in the grass beside me. "Go on," I whispered. He sniffed around the base of the perfectly trimmed hedge David had obsessed over for years. His pride, his trophy, the thing he'd complained I didn't appreciate enough. So of course Baxter lifted his leg and peed, right on the most manicured part of the landscaping. A small, entirely human part of me wanted to laugh. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a soft, cathartic laugh at the absurdity of it all. After everything, after the lies, the threat of fraud, the house, the title, the unraveling of a family, my scruffy little dog had delivered the most poetic punctuation mark possible. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ear as he finished. "Really, good boy." For the first time all night, my chest loosened enough to let a real breath in. One of the officers approached Robert again. Jessica was still crying near the porch. David hadn't moved. And Linda, God bless her, stood between them and me like a barrier made of quiet strength. But I didn't stay to watch the rest. I opened my car door, helped Baxter inside, and slid into the driver's seat with hands that were finally steady. As I began backing out of the driveway, the house loomed in my rear window, the place where my marriage had died long before tonight, and where it had finally, irreversibly, been laid to rest. The red and blue flashes lit up the interior of my car as I drove past the cluster of police cruisers, the lights catching in my rearview mirror like faint echoes of a storm I'd finally outrun. For the first time in years, the road ahead felt open, not easy, not clean, but mine. The foreclosure process would take time. Papers, filings, notices, hearings, months of slow, steady untangling. But none of that frightened me anymore. Because tonight, right here, driving away from the house that had been both stage and prison, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Completely, utterly free. 6 months had passed since that stormy night. Since the confrontation that had shaken every corner of my life, every secret, every assumption I'd clung to for decades. And here I was, standing barefoot in the warm, sand-colored soil of my little Florida cottage, hands buried in earth, fingers smeared with the scent of rosemary. basil, and freshly turned dirt. The sun had risen slow and deliberate over the horizon, stretching its golden fingers across the beach, brushing the waves into shimmering silver. The salty tongue of the ocean hung in the air, mingling with the faint, comforting scent of jasmine climbing along the porch trellis. Baxter, blissfully untethered from all obligations of propriety, was sprinting along the shoreline, ears flapping in the wind, fur a small, frantic brown and gray blur chasing gulls who squawked indignantly at his audacious pursuit. He barked once, twice, a sharp, joyous sound, and I laughed, a full, unrestrained laugh that felt as much a part of me as my heartbeat. It had been so long since I'd allowed myself to simply exist, to revel in the simple, unhurried beauty of a morning that belonged only to me and the small, steadfast creature at my side. The cottage itself was modest, but perfect. A little sun-bleached haven where the ocean could remind me that life continued, relentless and healing, beyond the mistakes and betrayals that had once weighed me down. I'd sold the large house David's inheritance. Though it had never truly been his to claim it in doing so, I had recovered my money, my dignity, and my sense of control. Every coin I had lent had returned to me, and with it, a measure of justice tempered by mercy. I hadn't kept the grand estate to punish my son. I'd simply chosen a new path, one where the horizon was mine to shape, not his to manipulate. I paused for a moment, brushing soil from my hands, and glanced toward Baxter. He was now perched on a low dune, nose twitching at the wind, tail wagging as though the entire beach were his playground. I felt a pang of gratitude for his presence, for the small anchor of loyalty and affection he had always provided, even when the rest of the world felt uncertain or cruel. He had been my companion through nights filled with quiet plotting, long phone calls with Robert, and the gentle unraveling of my own doubts. And he remained steadfast, a small, living reminder that love, unconditional, messy, and unwavering, could still exist in a world full of disappointment. I sank to the porch steps, letting my fingers trace the grooves in the sun-warmed wood. A glass of iced tea waited beside me, condensation slowly dripping onto the faded rug. I lifted it to my lips, savoring the sharp sweetness, letting the ice click gently against the glass as I exhaled. The ocean's steady pulse reached my ears, mingling with the distant cries of gulls and the whisper of waves against the sand. In this moment, I allowed myself to reflect, to feel the full weight of what had transpired. Linda had written to me several times over the past months. We exchanged letters as if pen pals from distant shores, sharing small insights, laughter over family absurdities, and genuine gratitude. She was no longer caught in the machinations of her daughter or son-in-law. She was free in her own right, and in helping her, I had learned something vital. Boundaries, though sometimes hard to enforce, were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of preservation. I had preserved my heart, my integrity, and, for the first time in decades, my sense of peace. I reflected on the trust fund I had established for my grandchildren. Not a fortune, but a carefully structured plan with a neutral trustee. Distributions conditional upon David and Jessica completing financial counseling and maintaining stable employment. They had squandered the gift of entitlement, but perhaps through structure, accountability, and time, they might learn the same lessons I had learned the hard way, that money, like love, comes with responsibility. And respect must always be earned, not demanded. I smiled faintly at the thought that this small act of foresight might plant seeds of growth for generations to come, seeds rooted in accountability, not fear. Baxter returned, paws damp from the tide, jumping onto my lap without warning. I laughed again, a softer, more contented sound, and stroked his fur. "You know, Baxter," I murmured, "they all thought we were fragile. They thought I was a woman of cookies and knitting, gentle enough to be pushed aside without consequence." I felt the truth in my words deepen, resonating not as a threat, but as a declaration. But they forgot. We're the ones who survive the storm so they can stand in the sun. And if you push us into the shadow, we bring the storm with us. I let the words linger, tasting them in the salt-tinged air. They felt like a benediction, a final acknowledgement of every trial, every betrayal, every tear I had shed in solitude. And in the distance, the gulls circled, the tide rolled in rhythm, and Baxter barked once more, joyous and free, as if echoing my own heart. I sipped the last of my iced tea, feeling it slide down my throat, refreshing and grounding. There was no grand applause, no dramatic acknowledgement, no sudden fanfare. Just the sun, the sand, the steady pulse of the ocean, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that I had done what I came here to do. I had reclaimed my life. I had reclaimed my freedom. And I had done it with integrity, with love, and with the quiet, undeniable power of a grandmother who refuses to be invisible. I leaned back against the railing of the porch and watched the horizon, letting the wind carry the faint scent of possibility across my face. The waves whispered promises I hadn't dared to hear in years, that new beginnings were real, that justice could be tempered with mercy, that survival could blossom into joy, that even after the harshest storms the sun would shine again. And in that moment, I felt it fully, every fiber of me alive with it, peace, freedom, triumph, and a deep, unshakable hope. If you followed Amy's journey and felt the emotional weight of every choice, every triumph, every moment of quiet resilience, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that celebrate strength, courage, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people. You won't want to miss what comes next.